There are hundreds of thousands of players, all experiencing the New World beta, in what is effectively the state it will be in come launch on August 31st. The question is New World a standout that's worth playing, or is it another half-baked MMO experience? What's up, friends? It's Livid here, one half of the team behind Legacy Gaming. And today we wanted to share our impressions of New World, Amazon Game Studios' last living video game. So buckle up, this is going to be one doozy of a video. We're just going to be upfront here with how we feel about this game. Personally, we don't think it's great, but it could be. It could easily use another year or more of development time. Now we're prepared for the army of streamers and other creators aiming to make this their big game, to come in here vibrantly praising what the game does well. But we really just feel Amazon doesn't still fully understand what objectively makes a fulfilling MMO experience, something we plan to really dive into here. However, we do think it's important to highlight the things that are working within the game after its additional year of polish. Some are pretty face value, while others, they're a little deeper underneath. Let's start with the most obvious thing that we're sure is responsible for capturing the public's attention at large: the visuals. Now, we won't deny that this MMO looks better than pretty much every other MMO out there. Nearly every place you travel, the environment and lighting is extremely picturesque in all directions. And that constantly brings in a relaxing, yet unknown atmosphere to the player. Even some of these vistas that look out over an area are drop-dead gorgeous. The team has done a fantastic job capturing the historical fantasy vibe that they're going for here. There are, however, a few glaring issues, at least to us, that we really feel stand out. While everything is beautiful, you'll spend a solid 20+ hours moving between the various starting zones, and a lot of these areas really feel too similar. We get that they are starting zones, and that are designed to put each player on an equal footing, but it turns the whole starting region into a boring mess with very few landmarks to really make each place distinguishable. Once you really get used to that, you jump forward to later on in the game in higher level regions, and the visuals of these regions are so starkly different that you feel almost disconnected from the rest of the world that you've spent so long in already, almost immediately. Now, you spend so much time in regions that just feel like continuations of each other that the tonal shift, it's extremely abrupt and not in a good way. Think back to how WoW zones like Stranglethorn and Duskwood are smacked up against each other and just completely shift the tone of an area. And that theme is carried across the whole design of the game. New World seems to be fighting with that in a sense, and a large part of it is that it's being grounded in historical and realistic elements. Now, we feel they could do so much more with this being a place where civilizations could have left distinct marks. Imagine if there were zones of ancient Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Norse, and more that just made each part of the world feel like cultures colliding. Instead, it just kind of feels like a generic island in the middle of an ocean. And that's a huge missed opportunity in our opinion. The music in New World is of equal quality. It features a stellar background score that genuinely plays into the feeling of adventuring. It's part of the overall experience without it ever getting in the way, but unfortunately, that's about where it stops. While it's great, the music doesn't feel iconic. There is nothing thematic about any certain piece that makes you feel connected to a certain place. Just look at something like Stormwind's music from WoW. That sort of thing just doesn't exist here, and maybe that's because, as we stated before, the world, for the most part, is pretty generic. Now here is where the game absolutely shines. The resource gathering and crafting systems in the game are easily the most developed part in not only New World, but probably across most MMOs. There is a massive range of resources to learn about and collect, all of which tie directly into your trade skills. As you harvest the wide variety of resources, all with immersive animations, you'll rank up these trade skills by crafting and harvesting whatever is directly related to each one. Even fishing, something that I feel like every MMO really struggles to get right, manages to implement a really solid system for it here. So hats off to the team for that one. As you progress your trade skills, you unlock unique bonuses such as the ability to use your compass to directly track certain resources as you get within range of them. The higher your level, the more and more resources will open up to be harvested. It's one of the first games that makes resource gathering feel genuinely important to your progression, and the sheer density of the resources in the world is a really smart play that helps add to the system's overall value. With resource gathering being such a strong foundational element of the game, one would only hope that the crafting would be then just as good. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are happy to report that certainly doesn't disappoint. There is an absolute metric ton of things to learn about and craft, and players who enjoy this sort of gameplay loop from other games like WoW, Final Fantasy XIV, and more will honestly thoroughly enjoy this aspect of the game. No questions asked. The foundation for a truly great system is here, and if they continue to expand on it over the life of the game, this will truly be one of the best modern gathering and crafting systems in-game. Now, you can't really enjoy any of this stuff if the UI of a game isn't polished and readable. Compared to where this game's UI was at its alpha state to where it is just now a year later, they have made substantial overhauls to it, and they are honestly for the better. Clearly understanding where your quests are located once tracked, what level you need to be to harvest certain materials, and how to navigate the intricacies of factions and companies are all really clean and straightforward for the most part. Now, this all doesn't mean that there still isn't work to be done here. First off, the menus need to go further to really help players understand what the important takeaways are in each menu, whether that be through some sort of highlighting in a sea of text or other features that make players immediately grasp foundational level systems. One of our biggest complaints is that the UI needs modularity right out of the gate. Give players the control over the scale, size, and positioning of their UI elements. Both Kodiak and myself think the UI is extremely clean, but it's massively oversized in our opinion, something that we wish we could just easily change. Now, we could just easily pivot to what is bad here, but we also think that there are some things that aren't exactly terrible and don't exactly fit into the good or the bad. They are more decent foundations that need heavy work still. This is what brings us to combat in the game, the singular thing that will hold New World back in the long run. I don't think it's a stretch to say the game's combat is ridiculously shallow, and while the emphasis on the items is what provides players their choice of skills, it completely strips players of their identity in the world, because you can change your identity on a dime. You can literally level every single weapon and change them out on the fly for whatever situation you're faced with. Skill trees are largely just stat boosts, and for the most part, incredibly superficial. There aren't even that many abilities in the skill trees for each weapon to really choose from. So after just a couple of hours, you've pretty much experienced all your skills on a particular weapon. And you still likely have hundreds of hours to go in terms of your character's progression to use at max 3 skills you prefer on your hotbar. Because you aren't forced to make real decisions that augment your kits more dramatically, combat overall becomes incredibly stale. In most instances, it boils down to attack, dodge, repeat, with very little variation in between. That is an incredibly boring system, and the lack of depth here is what is going to make the rest of the game feel even more lackluster. The combat overall already plays slower than most MMOs, and as much as I hate to make this comparison, it almost feels like an extremely watered-down Souls-like game, due to the fact that you will spend a lot of your time looking for your attack window amidst all your dodging and blocking. Positioning actually matters because none of the combat is tab targeted, and that's something we would be totally fine with if there was more depth to it. There are even tons of instances where you can just muscle through enemies while spamming attacks, even though the optimal route is to mitigate damage by utilizing those block and dodge mechanics. It's abundantly clear that this combat system is designed for PvP, which was the original intent of the game. We've seen some incredibly high-skill players that make the combat look visually brilliant, watching their stamina and countering readable attacks. But PvP isn't the only thing that players want in an MMO. We get that there is a whole camp of players who also probably enjoy this generic flexibility, as it lets you enjoy all aspects of content more casually. Sadly, it never makes us feel truly attached to our characters or the choices that we make for our characters. It's also strange that due to our characters being essentially a Swiss Army knife, we only end up really having one single character per server. Now, I can't say that I'd want to level another character, with how absolutely awful the leveling and questing systems are in the game, something that we're going to touch on just in a bit. One thing that has definitely improved since last year are the choices players have when it comes to weapons. During the 2020 alpha, players had a pool of just 7 to choose from. Now, that number's up to 11. This is good, because a lot of players were unhappy with the lack of diversity in this particular area of the game. Because there are no classes, having a deep pool of weapons to choose from gives the combat a bit more depth. But as we already talked about there, we've still got a lot of work to do. Now, more weapons is good, but as you add, you have to also think about balance. Remember, there are PvE elements, but also a major PvP element, and trying to keep everything in line gets a lot more complicated when you're dealing with more variety factors in solo play versus group play. And you can imagine how even the slightest change could have a drastic effect. One thing that hasn't changed since last year is the depth of the talent system that accompanies each weapon. Sure, they adjusted some skills and balanced them a bit, but the system is still the same. As your proficiency with a particular weapon goes up, you will get to build out your playstyle by allocating points. But here is where we run into another big issue: the limited pool of talents, and most having little to no real impact on the playstyle itself. Yes, you get to choose certain abilities, and that does allow for a little bit of flexibility. But the rest of the points, they're just merely stat boosts that elevate your effectiveness in combat. They don't actually allow you to create a more diverse playstyle. This is definitely an area that comes down to preference. But because there are no classes, and as of this point, you're limited to just 6 skills across 2 different weapons, talents could be a way for players to find their own identity in the game through the combat choices that they're making. It's pretty obvious that right now, something with the combat isn't clicking. Just go watch a few videos of straight gameplay and you'll see it's robotic, stiff, and overall just not that engaging. But by giving players more options with talents and making those talents actually mean something, you may help alleviate some of those issues. Adding more weapons is great, and the new additions like the Ice Gauntlet and Rapier are cool. But if we really want to get to the heart of the issue, we have to drill down even deeper to some of the underlying systems that are holding the combat experience back. This brings us to the dungeon experience, otherwise known as expeditions in New World. And they're a section of content that just a year ago never existed. With their plan to overhaul the PvE element of the game, this is clearly where most of that attention went to. We will say the expedition content is enjoyable, but it does feel a bit simplified from what we've played. The expeditions function like traditional MMOs in the sense that there will be checkpoint moments with key encounters and bosses to take on. Each boss will have a series of mechanics that range from dealing with ad spawns to AoE attacks that you need to evade. Pretty simple stuff that didn't exactly wow us yet, but was a large contrast to most of the enemies that you face in the overworld content. Now, classic MMO classes are pretty much essential here, as you'll need a tank to hold aggro, DPS characters to burn it all down, and a healer or 2 for those essential heals and protective buffs. Thankfully, all of that is present in some form with the design of the weapons in the game. Now, we'd love to see that become a more present thing in the overworld, but we understand the more casual nature of things there. These expeditions are a huge step in the right direction for PvE content, but this is not the end-all be-all, as more systems really need to be built around group content to make it more valuable. While there are a lot of players trying them out now, if they end up leaving dungeons to just go back and do the same 20 gathering quests, it's going to bring the entire game back down a few pegs. The adventuring experience should tie directly into these expedition set pieces, in that the elements from here should make smaller appearances in the overworld, around these zones. Right now, the questing is so disjointed that expeditions almost feel like floating entities that could instead be huge attractions if the rest of the zones were designed around them. There's also the issue of no real matchmaking system, akin to how old school WoW content had people just talking in chat to form groups. While we do enjoy the amount of social interaction that comes with this, at one point, it took us nearly an hour to fill out a group. This ends up wasting a lot of players' time, and it really feels antiquated the more you experience it. A simple option to allow both forms of LFG to thrive would be a solid fix in our eyes. Now, the last thing that needs to be talked about are the game's absolutely glaring faults. These boil down to a few core problems with the game, the first of which is questing. It's awful, full stop, let us explain. As it stands right now, nearly the entire leveling process from 1 to 60 continues to be the same quests, recycled over and over, and we aren't exaggerating that. The game was delayed a year to improve the PvE experience, but it's clear this area was barely touched. It doesn't matter what zone you're in, you will get a quest to either go to a location and loot some chests, or go to a location and kill some enemies. It was this way in the alpha, and over the course of a full year, there is still no improvement to this system. The questing, and by proxy the leveling system, is so bad that players are just completely skipping the mind-numbing runs 2 kilometers and back for town projects, which strangely provided the quickest and honestly most efficient source of experience in the game. Now, of course, that was patched, but people are still doing it. You go to the town board, pick up every quest, and those that you deem too tedious, you simply abandon, and a new quest from the pool will take its place. What you're left with is a series of crafting and short distance exploration and hunting quests that take a fraction of the time of anything else in the game, for rewards that far surpass everything else in the game. Doing a full batch of quests from NPCs in a town, the town projects, and even faction missions take an obscene amount of time, as the game decides to make you run, like I said, 2 kilometers in one direction only for you to have to double back the same distance. Even worse, the XP that you got from these quests absolutely pales in comparison to simply doing the town projects by themselves that I mentioned earlier. Spend an hour running around the world mining, hunting, gathering, and more. Once you've topped off your storage shed in your favorite location, you just do these quests, and you can proceed to burn through those materials in a fraction of the time. Spam completing town projects. I kid you not, doing this, I gained 6 to 7 levels in only 2 hours, compared to barely scraping out 2 in that same time with lackluster questing. The leveling experience in New World completely takes away from what should be a core enjoyable experience from start to finish. You shouldn't look at this as a grind to get to endgame where content's more fun. All the content should be fun. The entire point of an MMO is the journey as well as the destination. And right now, players are skipping the journey in favor of the destination in absolute droves. In addition, never in our lives of playing an MMO have we experienced a quest system that actively dissuades players from adventuring together. Aside from the main quest and some side quests that might pop up, every other quest in the game from vendors is randomized from a pool. And as a result, you could be partying with several friends only to find that you all have quests in completely different areas. This is nothing short of just plain stupid. We get that they want players running around the world back and forth constantly to give the impression that this game is teeming with active players. But this ain't it, Chief. Forcing players to split up or waste time in areas with no current objectives for at least half the group is poor questing design. This could, in theory, be mitigated if New World wasn't also missing another core system found in basically every other MMO, the ability to share quests with your party. Seriously, why isn't this in the game? Are they worried that would allow players to abuse town projects for even faster leveling? Who knows, but we are pretty tired of always having to split off from our friends. Why this isn't a feature in all MMOs in 2021 is absolutely beyond me. But the last factor that easily hinders the New World experience is the lack of any real compelling story, and the overall world building that comes from establishing a narrative. This is a problem that plagues every MMORPG, and that's because it's such a fundamental pillar for a lot of players. People want to connect with the characters. They want to travel to distant lands and learn about backstories and history, but New World just doesn't do enough of a good job connecting those dots. The biggest change from last year to this year was the addition of a mild main story quest, and voice acting when accepting most quests. And while this is a step in the right direction, it's not nearly enough. Story obviously ties into the questing, and while we've already touched on that, I think it's important to talk about it again from this perspective. When used effectively, quests can be used as a vessel to tell major and minor stories, give the world context and meaning. As it currently stands, you literally do the same 3 quest structures over and over again. And while you do have to travel across the world to complete those quests, it's not in a fun way. We think this is the problem with trying to create something from nothing. It's something most MMORPGs struggle with because they have to literally craft the entirety of the world from the ground up. Games like World of Warcraft, Lord of the Rings Online, even Final Fantasy don't have to do that as much because they can pull from an existing world. This is at the center of New World's story-related issues. And as far as most players are concerned, you're just stranded on a mysterious island that's filled with warring factions and things that want to kill you. There is, of course, one major figure in the New World landscape, Isabella. But unless you're Sir Medieval, who has literally absorbed every ounce of New World lore and backstory, average player just isn't going to pick up on what's actually going on. And honestly, it's not a lot. The team has been trying to build on this since last year. There are plenty of books and manuscripts to read, but let's be honest here. There aren't a whole lot of people who are going to read walls of text. This is something the team can improve on over time. I mean, seriously. Just look at how long it took to establish some of the other ongoing fantasy worlds that we love today. But that all depends on if there's enough at the onset to keep people sticking around. Story isn't everything, but it's one pillar of the MMORPG experience, and it's something that touches other fundamental systems of the game. And for that reason alone, it needs to be front and center. Alright friends, that was a lot to get through, and honestly, there are so many more elements that we could speak on within the game. While the world is absolutely gorgeous and it's a fun sandbox to have open-ended adventures with your friends, New World is still very much sitting at a foundational level. Regions of the world need to have more standout landmarks to make them recognizable at a distance. The questing and leveling process needs a real hard look to get us to be excited about it in the slightest. Fast travel using Azoth really doesn't feel good, and part of that is due to there being no mounts. Even a simple horse to ease those 2-kilometer runs there and back would go a long way to easing this huge pain point of the game. The weapon pool and combat is enjoyable, but just needs a lot more options. The mechanics and enemies in expeditions need a lot more depth, and for that depth to spill over into the overworld in a more prevalent way. And finally, New World needs a more in-your-face story, with elements really leaking into everything you're doing in the game in a more obvious way. With hundreds of lore pieces in the game, use those to inspire more quests that make the players feel more connected to the world. We could go on for hours about where New World can go from here. We don't think the game is great by any stretch, but it definitely could be given more time. If you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. Hit that thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Every bit of support really does help us out. Even a comment down below discussing what you think about New World so far goes a long way to building a healthy discussion about the games that we love. We also invite you to join us on Discord. We've got a great community of nearly 7,000 spread across dozens of great games, but there's always room for a few more. Check out the link below to join today. That's it, everyone. My name is Livid, and from everyone here at Legacy Gaming, thanks for watching, and play on.